There is a school of thought that states that most armed conflicts in the 20th century have been caused in some way or another by two players arguing over how to interpret wargaming rules. In certain aspects, the rules governing shooting in 2nd edition Warhammer 40,000 went into a level of detail that would feel uncomfortably patronising for a book in the children's section of a library. For example, this table to show the maximum range of certain weapons. As a kind of visual metaphor, this table sums up the style of rules for the shooting phase quite nicely. At first glance, it appears both an extremely simple and overly long-winded way of stating the absolutely bleeding obvious. Until, for instance, during play, someone fires a bolt pistol at a model exactly 8 inches away, and you have to decide whether to apply the short range or the long range 2 hit modifier. Witnesses on the scene after Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot heard someone yell, "It's short range now, you filthy casual." You can still see the Rogue Trader era role-playing style roots of the game system in the 2nd edition rule set, as all the rules for shooting, although overlong and complicated, followed a simple path that would make for a decent workable skirmish game. In fact, Necromunda used this rule set with minimal changes years later to great effect, as did Gorka Morka. The problems here begin not when you start the game, but when you group a bunch of single models into a unit and then try and conglomerate all of their shooting against a group of opposing models that are also bunched into a unit. Allow me to demonstrate. Your Space Marine wants to fire in the shooting phase. Just use the model's eye view and their 90-degree fire arc to pick a target. Units or vehicles must fire at the closest squad or closest vehicle, or they can fire at a building or game objective, i.e. a bunker in the bunker assault mission. A target unit or vehicle that is in cover may be ignored in favour of a unit or vehicle that is in the open. You may ignore units with broken morale or units in hand-to-hand combat. After picking a target, remembering that you couldn't fire more than 2 inches into woodland, you just apply the effect of cover on the dice roll, -2 for hard cover and -1 for soft cover, roll to wound, your opponent rolls for an armor save, and you are good to go. It seems simple and intuitive, right? However, as soon as you group up that single model into a squad and have them carry out the same set of actions against enemy squads in turn-based combat, you run into a number of problems. Specifically, 10 problems. Now, before we get started, I'm not doing this to criticise the brave hobby game writers who ventured into the wargaming mines to chisel out this early example of a rule set. I'm doing this because if you want to play a game of 2nd edition these days, you are going to need to repeat the words I say to my personal manservant before we start the bridge sessions in the shed. We are going to need to set some ground rules here before we start. I know a lot of people think that these days, every model having a 360-degree arc of fire frequently leads to unusual and unthematic moves, like parking a tank sideways between 2 terrain pieces and firing its front-mounted weapon at a unit directly behind it. Personally, I just accept it as a weird quirk of a turn-based wargame, rather than believing it proves that the modern Games Workshop is run by the second coming of the Dark Lord Sauron. Weapons or grenades can only be thrown in a 90-degree fire arc, which makes sense in theory. However, in practice, it was another gotcha rule, as infantry models could be rotated in the movement phase without penalty. In reality, in all but the worst cases, you would either forget to check, or your opponent would kindly point out if you had forgotten to reposition each model in your army every turn. However, if you were particularly cunning, you could rotate in position to make sure that you could only see the unit, or sometimes the model you wanted to target. In fact, this wasn't just some beardy strategy a socially awkward opponent would drop on you in the middle of a 3-hour game. It was actually covered in a diagram of the rules regarding on how to split fire from a squad. The rest of the time, squads could only split fire if the models had special or heavy weapons and wanted to target vehicles instead of infantry. But you can't fire at a model you can't see. In fact, according to page 26, some players use miniature periscopes or a series of mirrors to check line of sight. My wife says a miniature periscope might come in useful for me. Hold on, wait. I quote verbatim, "Heroes and special characters are allowed to fire at whatever they please." And so ends the single line of text defining what characters can target. Except they aren't allowed to fire at whatever they please, because 40 pages later the rule changes to, if a character is within coherency distance of a squad of other models of comparable size to themselves or larger, then they may not be picked out as a specific target by the enemy, including enemy characters. In which case you would fire at the unit and then randomise whatever hits you got against either the squad or the character. Back to that line again. Heroes and special characters are allowed to fire at whatever they please. This might start to melt your brain, but do they mean heroes or do they mean characters? Bear in mind, characters weren't always labelled as characters back then. They were called, wait for it, heroes. Also, you had 3 or more different tiers of heroes, confusingly called champions, heroes, and mighty heroes. Champions join units and never leave them, like the chaplain leading the death company. Meanwhile, heroes act differently. And when I say heroes, I mean heroes in the sense of heroes and mighty heroes. I think this means that champion level heroes leading squads fire at whatever their squad is firing at, and heroes and mighty hero level heroes can pick any squad or vehicle they like, except of course anything defined as a character that was within coherency range of an enemy unit and presumably not specific enemy models engaged in close combat. If you've liked the content up to here, consider writing the channel's URL over your body in a Sharpie and streaking onto the pitch during a large sporting event. Or, if that's not for you, support the channel on our Ko-fi page for wonderful extra content, link in the description below. After working out what you could actually shoot at, it's time to work out if your targets are in cover. Hard cover includes walls, vehicles, trenches and rocks. Soft cover includes vegetation, hedges and woods. You can really tell the type of terrain they expected players to be using on their battlefields based on what you could find at your local model train shop. The rules go into depth about the difference between hard and soft cover, but what happens in situations where a squad does not all have the same benefit of cover? Well, then we hit the famous point in the rules where the designers throw their hands up and allow you, the player, to work it out yourself. You have 2 options. You can split the roles of the firing squad so that some of them are targeting the unit in cover and some of them are targeting the part of the unit in the open, or use an averaging out method where if the majority of the squad is in the open, ignore the effect of cover. If the majority of the squad are in cover and some of them are in the open, reduce the effect of the cover by 1, and if the entire squad is in cover but it's a mix between hard and light cover, count it all as soft cover. What this means in practice is that you get -2 to hit if the entire squad is in hard cover. If not, you get -1 to hit if the majority of the squad is in hard cover or the entire squad is in a mix of cover. It's up to the players to decide which one to use, but the designers state that the second method is only right and proper. But what if you can't actually see the rest of the squad and they are completely out of line of sight? Is that hard cover? Is that even cover? I have no answers here. We are finally at the stage where you can start rolling dice. But not so fast, as we are back to a common theme, which is to tell you how a rule works and then telling you to ignore that and do something else instead. First, look up your ballistic skill in a table to see what number you need to roll on a dice. Then, if your ballistic skill is over 5, ignore that number and instead roll a 2 or more. The 2 hit modifiers affect the dice roll, so even if you had a ballistic skill 10 model who was firing at a very rapidly moving target that was behind hard cover, you would deduct 4 from the roll, meaning that you needed a 6 to hit. This is the exact system that Rogue Trader used when it was released in 1987, and it had exactly the same redundancy. 3rd edition eliminated ballistic skills above 5 in 1998, and 8th edition finally eliminated the need for a table in 2017, 30 years later. The rules state that you get +1 to hit if a target is classified as elephant-sized plus. This rating includes land raiders and buildings, but doesn't include dreadnoughts or land speeders. But how would you go about doing that? Well, just ask your local hobby shop for White Dwarf issue 116, published in August 1989, turn to the inside front cover and you will see a handy reference elephant that was presumably published for use in this instance. All you need to do was work out if elephant-sized plus meant its mass, its height, width or length, and then you would have to estimate those values based on the photo. Easy. But wait a minute, the physical size of land speeders changed in 1994, so if you picked this up in 1993, you'd use the Rogue Trader era land speeder as your frame of reference. It's not like they showed off any other land speeder models at any time that had completely different dimensions. If you were playing these days, you could attempt to use the Mummakil from Lord of the Rings as your reference elephant, but no one has ever done that and survived. The weirdest part of this rule is that they had an iconic model that had been around since the late 80s that was around the right dimensions to be an ideal size reference for other models in the Warhammer 40,000 range that most players would have heard of, if not owned already, and it just so happened to be named after another large grey coloured land mammal that also sometimes lives alongside elephants in the wild. Now, if the designers had simply used a reference banana like tarot models, we would be in business. There are a few times when you will have to randomise the hits you get against whatever you are firing at, such as when you are firing into combat, when you are firing at a unit with a character within 2 inches of it, or when you are unsure of where to remove casualties from a unit. Now, this might just be me, but randomising hits is harder than it seems. If you have a selection of 6 models, you're okay, just roll a d6 and work it out. If you have a larger unit, say one larger than the largest dice you own, it gets complicated. For instance, 24 models, you'd need to roll a d6 first to separate the unit into 2 halves, and then roll a d12 to see which model in which half you hit. But what about if you have 7 assault marines and a character in combat with 28 orcs and a war boss, and some of those models are within range of an objective or another area of importance? Suddenly you have to carry out a mid-battle small GCSE maths question to work out how to pick 1 out of 37 models with only a handful of d6 dice that were knocking around. And remember, although the rule set frequently referred to a d4, d8, d10, d12 and d20, none of those dice were in the box set. In fact, none of those dice were in any box sets, or blister packs, or in fact sold in any Games Workshop stores at this time to my knowledge. After you resolve this, we are nearly out of the woods in terms of problems. In fact, we are back to the point that once again the designers felt like adding in a table that explained that 5 minus 1 equals 6, 4 times in a row. Now again, I'm not having a pop at the brave rules writers here who forged a path into the perilous jungle to deliver us this groundbreaking rule system. This was 1993, therefore pre-internet, pre-large scale playtesting, and pre-tournament players abusing rules loopholes. In fact, talking of abusing loopholes, there were a couple. With weapons that use a blast marker, simply pop it centered on a model in the unit. If you hit, great. If you missed, you roll the scatter and artillery dice and move the template that many inches. If you get a misfire, the shot is a dud. If you get a hit and a misfire, the blast marker is placed over the firing model and the weapon is destroyed. The shot cannot scatter more than half the distance between the firer and the target, so you can't get into a situation where it scatters behind the firer. If it's a grenade, half the distance rolled. Also, the range of grenades is dependent on the strength of the thrower. Sounds simple, right? What could go wrong? Well, when you use weapons that have blast markers, you nominate a target model for the marker to be centered on, rather than just hitting the closest model in the unit. And that's where things get weird. You see, if you wanted to kill the only model with a heavy weapon in a squad, ideally you would want a weapon with a blast marker that could only hit the model with the heavy weapon. Otherwise, if you hit your target and another couple of models, the ones removed would be the ones closest to the firing unit as per the rules on removing casualties. However, if you used a weapon that only had a 1-inch blast marker, like a melter missile, graviton gun, or in some cases against weaker models, shotguns, you could focus your hits on the specific heavy weapons sergeant, or in the ideal scenario, a champion leading the unit. The best or worst case scenario here, depending on your perspective, is removing the chaplain leading a large unit of death company, which would then cause the entire unit to split apart and start moving randomly until they wandered into charge distance of something. Sustained fire dice look really cool, and from an outsider's point of view, you would just assume you rolled them and that was the amount of shots you got. If that was me, I'd have done that, left it there and moved on. However, that was not the case. The actual method of using them was far more complicated. You make 1 hit roll and then roll to see how many shots you get. Then, you allocate 1 to the initial target and the rest to the models within 4 inches. 2 years later, an FAQ in White Dwarf 191 stated that these additional hits may not be allocated to models that are harder to hit than the original model. So, just hit the first model and then pick out your heavy weapons troopers, characters, and in fact any models you can see within 4 inches. Luckily, the weapons using sustained fire dice were famously really weak in this edition, and absolutely no threat to any characters out there. Oh, any jams mean the model must miss its next shooting phase. However, rules as written means that a vehicle with multiple weapons cannot fire anything if it wants to clear just 1 jam for 1 gun. However, I'm pretty sure that is almost certainly a mistake. At this point, you might be confused by the bombardment of new and strange rules, but luckily, if you were struggling to remember anything during gameplay, you could refer to the single sheet of A4 card they put in the box to act as a quick reference guide for new players. Except... the developers found a clever way to summarise these extremely long rules to fit on a reference sheet. Their method was just to leave bits out. After all, you can't have a debate about if you got +1 to hit an elephant-sized model if no one knew that rule existed. However, you could have a long debate about how you go about firing at troops riding in or on a vehicle, as the reference guide seems to be the only place that modifier or ability was ever mentioned. At least this guide does clarify that if you fail a charge, you make a double move in the intended direction, which is something I missed out of my video on how to navigate the movement phase. In fact, speaking of that, if you want to watch that video, you can watch it here. There are additional rules to firing blast weapons into the confined spaces, targeting the ground, armor penetration drop-off for firing at vehicles, and of course Overwatch. But all that's a tale for another day. This has been Old and Demon, and I'll see you next time.